More than 56 years have passed since the Brady Bunch first aired on ABT, and the faces that smiled at you from that iconic split-level home went on to live stories no viewer could have predicted. They were America's ideal family, wholesome, warm, impossibly cheerful. But behind the cameras, the truth was far more complicated. One of them, the man who played the father, carried a secret so deeply buried that even his closest friends never knew the full weight of it until after his death. Another, the girl the whole country idolized as the perfect eldest daughter, fell into a years-long spiral of addiction so severe that she traded her dignity for drugs and nearly vanished from the world entirely. A third walked away from Hollywood altogether and built a life with his hands in a city that had nothing to do with fame. There were 9 people bound together by 5 seasons and 17 episodes, and then, in the final weeks, a 10th arrived to change the story one last time. What happened to all of them after the cameras stopped rolling is a story worth telling, quietly, carefully, and without looking away. He was 9 years old when he walked onto a set that was already ending, and he has spent the 50-plus years since carrying the distinction of being the person television history blames for killing. The Brady Bunch. It was not his fault. That part needs to be said clearly, before anything else. Robert Anthony Rist was born on April 4, 1964, in La Mirada, California, to German immigrant parents who did not set out to raise an actor. What they raised instead was a boy who became obsessed, at age 4, with Universal Studios horror films from the 1930s, a child who nagged his parents so relentlessly about wanting to be in a monster movie that they finally took him to an audition, convinced he would find the process tedious and give up. He passed that audition, and the next 6, by the time he was 8, he was a working television actor. He had studied violin since the age of 3. He cited Lon Chaney Jr. in The Wolf Man as his first great artistic influence. He was not, in any meaningful sense, a typical child. When the producers of The Brady Bunch cast him as Cousin Oliver in 1974, the show was visibly struggling. The original 6 children were teenagers now, too old for the family-friendly innocence the series required, not old enough to anchor a more adult storyline. The solution, as the network saw it, was to introduce a younger child. Oliver was written as Carol Brady's orphan nephew, wide-eyed and accident-prone, the kind of character designed to reset the show's energy. Rist was 9 years old and had no way of knowing that the studio had already quietly decided not to renew the series before his first episode aired. He appeared in 6 episodes. The character became, almost immediately, a cultural shorthand for creative desperation, Cousin Oliver syndrome, the phrase still used decades later to describe any television series that adds an implausibly cute child to arrest declining ratings. It was a label applied to a decision made by network executives. Robbie Rist himself was a child who showed up and did his job. After the Brady Bunch, he worked steadily in the Mary Tyler Moore Show, where he played Ted Baxter's adopted son, in the Saturday morning series Big John, Little John, in voice acting work that would eventually define the second chapter of his career. In 1990, he became the voice of Michelangelo in the first live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, and reprised the role in the 2 sequels that followed. He voiced characters in Naruto and Final Fantasy X. He contributed music to the Sharknado franchise. He played bass, guitar, and drums in a series of Los Angeles rock bands, eventually becoming the drummer for a group called Your Favorite Trainwreck. Music, he has said, was never a choice. It chose him. "You don't choose to be a writer," he quoted Charles Bukowski in one interview. "Writing chooses you." He meant it about music. He has been married to Ali Risling since 2019. By 2006, Robbie Rist is 62 years old. He has spoken about Cousin Oliver with a composure that suggests someone who made peace with the label long ago, not by denying it, but by understanding that it had nothing to do with who he actually. He was a child actor asked to save a television show that had already decided to end. He did his job. The rest was someone else's story. She was the one who held the household together. Every week, from 1969 to 1974, Ann B. Davis appeared in that Brady kitchen with a spatula in her hand and a dry joke on her lips, and made Alice Nelson the kind of character viewers remembered. Long after they'd forgotten half the plots, she was the glue, the comedic anchor, the one constant in a house full of chaos. Ann B. Davis was 43 years old when The Brady Bunch premiered in September 1969, already a television veteran. Born on May 3, 1926, in Schenectady, New York, she had grown up in a family with deep roots in education and faith. She was the youngest of 4 children and had an identical twin sister named Harriet. That twin sister would quietly shape the most intimate creative decision Davis ever made. She studied theater at the University of Michigan, where she had originally enrolled as a pre-med student, only to switch to drama after watching her older brother perform in a campus production of Oklahoma. By the mid-1950s, she had become one of the most reliably funny women on American television, earning 2 Emmy Awards for her role as the shark-tongued secretary Schultze on The Bob Cummings Show. After winning her second consecutive Emmy in 1959, her twin Harriet sent her a telegram. One of us was bound to have twins. When the Brady Bunch came to her, the role of Alice could have been a footnote. Instead, it became the defining chapter of a long and distinguished career. But what no one on set knew for decades was that Davis had quietly invented a complete backstory for Alice, one she never shared until a 2004 interview. She decided, she said, that Alice was working as a housekeeper to put her twin sister through medical school because the sister couldn't afford tuition. It was a private fiction drawn from her own life, the bond with her own twin, the conviction that one person's sacrifice could become another's possibility. She played Alice for 5 seasons with that secret motivation tucked somewhere inside every scene. After the show ended, Davis made a choice that surprised many who knew her. She retreated from Hollywood, not out of bitterness or failure, but out of conviction. She had become deeply religious over the years, and in the 1970s she joined an Episcopal religious community in Colorado, later relocating to San Antonio, Texas, where she lived quietly and faithfully for the rest of her life. She returned occasionally for Brady reunions, always with the same easy smile, always carrying Alice with her like something she'd never quite put down. Maureen McCormick later said they remained close long after the show ended, flying to Texas to visit her, spending time in a friendship that had nothing to do with cameras. Ann B. Davis died on June 14 in San Antonio. In San Antonio, she was 88 years old. She had suffered a fall in her home and never recovered. She was, by every account, exactly who she appeared to be, and in Hollywood, that alone made her extraordinary. There is something almost unbearable about the way Florence Henderson died. It was Thanksgiving Day 2016. She was 82 years old, and just 3 days earlier, she had been sitting in the studio audience of Dancing with the Stars, watching Maureen McCormick dance, mouthing the words along with the crowd, Marcia. Marcia. It was her last public appearance. The woman who had played America's most beloved television mother left the world on the most family-oriented day of the American calendar, surrounded by the people who loved her. Florence Henderson was 35 years old when the Brady Bunch premiered, a Broadway star accepting a television sitcom. She was born on Valentine's Day, 1934, in Dale, Indiana, the youngest of 10 children in a family that struggled through the Depression and a father who drank and left when she was small. What almost no viewer knew was that her path to Broadway had begun at 17, when she arrived in New York City alone and nearly penniless, moving into a women's residence called the 3 Arts Club, a room she later compared to a walk-in closet. She enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts on a scholarship. She was barely old enough to vote when she landed her Broadway debut in 1952 in Wish You Were Here, and the producers of that show happened to include Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, who promptly cast her as the lead in the National Touring Company of Oklahoma. She went on to originate the title role in the musical Fanny in 1954 on Broadway itself, to star in The Sound of Music on tour, and to become one of the most recognizable voices in American musical theater. When the role of Carol Brady came her way, her closest friend Shirley Jones, another Broadway veteran, had already turned it down, saying she didn't want to play a stay-at-home mother. Henderson walked through the door Jones had left open. Behind the warmth was a private life of considerable complexity. In her 2011 memoir Life Is Not a Stage, she was candid about the loneliness of her first marriage, about bouts of depression that the image of Carol Brady could never contain, and about a one-night encounter during the filming years with a prominent New York politician, a man who was married, as she was at the time. It was an episode she described without glamour or self-pity. I was lonely. I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. So what did I do? I did it. She had not gone looking for scandal. She had gone looking for company. She kept working until the very end, Dancing with the Stars, reality programs, guest appearances. She never stopped. And when she went, suddenly, on a Thursday in November, the people who had loved her most were already there, already beside her. He hated the show. That is the part that gets left out of the nostalgic retellings, the reunion specials, the warm remembrances. Robert Reed, the man who smiled at you as Mike Brady every Friday night for 5 years, loathed the Brady Bunch with the particular fury of a trained Shakespearean actor who had been handed a role he considered beneath him. He was 36 years old when the series premiered in 1916. Born John Robert Rietz Jr. on October 19, 1932, in Highland Park, Illinois. From his earliest years, the stage was where he understood himself. He performed in 8 leading roles at Northwestern University under the celebrated drama coach Alvina Krauss, a woman who shaped the careers of generations of serious American actors. He studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. He returned to the United States and joined an off-Broadway theater company called the Shakespeare Rights, earning starring roles in Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream. When a producer first considered him for Mike Brady, the role being discussed was something else entirely, a television adaptation of Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park, a show that would have featured a mostly African-American cast and left no place for Reed. The Brady Bunch came to him as a consolation prize. He considered the pilot too lightweight to ever make the air. He was wrong. What Reed brought to that set, despite his disdain for the scripts, was a discipline and a professionalism that the younger actors absorbed without always knowing it. He took the Brady children to Europe on a cast trip to England, where he introduced them to the theater he had loved all his life and gave each of them a camera so they could document what they were seeing. Barry Williams described him as a surrogate father to all of them, a man who gave them more than the scripts ever asked. During the filming of the Brady Bunch, he was simultaneously appearing in the detective series Mannix, something almost no casual viewer knew. He went on to win critical praise for his work in the miniseries Rich Man, Poor Man in 1970 Teagues, and Roots in 1970 Teve, roles that showed what he might have built had he not been so permanently overshadowed by Mike Brady. Behind that professional life, something far more private was happening. Robert Reed was a gay man living in an era when Hollywood offered no safe space for that truth. He had been married briefly in the 1950s to a fellow student named Marilyn Rosenberger, and they had a daughter, Karen. The marriage ended in 1959. He never spoke publicly of his sexuality, not with Barry Williams, not with anyone. He carried it alone, in silence, for decades. He died on May 12, 1992. He was 59 years old. The official cause on his death certificate was colon lymphoma, but the document also listed hive infection among the contributing conditions. The cast expressed outrage at the way the media handled the disclosure after his death. Susan Olsen said simply that she believed being forced to hide who he was had cost him something irreplaceable. His tombstone reads, "Good night, Sweet Prince," a line from Hamlet. He would have chosen it himself. He was 14 years old when he became America's oldest Brady boy, and he had wanted to be an actor since he was 4. Barry Williams, born Barry William Blenkhorn on September 30, 1954, in Santa Monica, California, grew up as a neighbor of the actor Peter Graves, whom he idolized. At the age of 11, he took himself to an acting coach, enrolled in scene study courses, and changed his name from Blenkhorn to Williams. He appeared in educational films and commercials. He worked his way through Dragnet, Adam 12, Mission, Impossible, The Mod Squad. Guest appearances, small parts, the grinding apprenticeship of a child actor who was paying careful attention to everything. He was also the one who documented everything. His 1992 memoir, Growing Up Brady, pulled back the curtain on what had actually happened in those 5 seasons. The teenage crushes, the behind-the-scenes romances, the experiments with marijuana on. A trip to Hawaii, the moment a teenage Barry Williams convinced his TV mother Florence Henderson to go on a dinner date with him, which she good-naturedly accepted before making very clear it was not going anywhere. He also confirmed a genuine romance with Maureen McCormack during the filming years, a fact both have acknowledged, though neither has ever fully described what it was. After the Brady Bunch, he worked steadily in theater, in television, in reality programming. He appeared on The Masked Singer in 2022, competing alongside his TV brothers Christopher Knight and Mike Lookinland as the Mummies. By 2026, Barry Williams is 71 years old. He works as an ambassador for the Mediavi Classic Television Network and tours with his musical trio, Barry Williams and the Travelers, which includes his wife Tina Mahina. He remains, of all the surviving cast members, the one who seems most at peace with the full span of what the Brady Bunch was, and was not. He was 11 years old when he first appeared on screen as Peter Brady. Christopher Knight was born on November 7, 1957, in Manhattan, the second of 4 children of an actor father, Edward Knight, born Edward Kazumplik to parents from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a Jewish mother named Wilma. Only Christopher was offered parts. As a child, he had commercials for Toyota, Tide, and Cheerios. Guest roles on Mannix and Gunsmoke followed. And then, at 11, he was cast as Peter Brady, specifically, sources indicate, because his dark coloring matched that of Robert Reed, who was already signed as the father. He was not the first choice for any abstract reason. He looked right. What almost no one around him knew was that the boy playing the middle Brady son had originally wanted to be a scientist. "I wanted to wear the lab coat," he said in a 2019 interview. "Wanted to have the beakers, the Bunsen burners. That was my dream." The dream didn't disappear. It simply waited. After the Brady Bunch ended, Knight moved away from acting deliberately. He discovered technology. In 1988, describing himself as a self-professed geek, he took a job as an account sales manager at Martech Inc., a computer company that had nothing to do with entertainment. Within 18 months, he had closed the company's first $1 million sales deal. He was named Employee of the Year. From there, he became vice president at New Image Industry, and in 1991 co-founded Visual Software, a pioneering 3D graphics company, which he grew from $400 in annual sales to $2 million within 10 months. The company was acquired by Micrographs. He went on to found KidWise Learningware, an interactive educational products company for children, and his own TV tuner company, Escape Labs, which was later purchased by Hauppauge Computer Works. It was a career built from scratch in a field that had nothing to do with fame. He had used the people skills acquired from a childhood in front of cameras to become, of all things, a salesman, and then a founder, and then a vice president in industries that barely existed when. He was Peter Brady. If Germady act with a Stainbox problem. He has appeared on reality television, including My Fair Brady in 2005, which documented his relationship with America's Next Top Model contestant Adrienne Curry, whom he married and later divorced. He reunited with his castmates for a very Brady renovation in 2019 and made a brief appearance at the 2022 Emmy Awards. He married Kara Kokanese in 2016. By 2026, Christopher Knight is 68 years old. Of all the Brady children, he is perhaps the one who most completely fulfilled a life that the show could never have suggested. A child who wanted to be a scientist and, in his own way, became one. She was 11 years old when the Brady Bunch premiered, and Jan Brady, as written, was the most psychologically complicated of all the Brady children. The one who felt invisible. The one whose famous cry of Marcia, Marcia, Marcia resonated with nearly every middle child who ever watched. Eve Plum brought that frustration to life with a naturalness that made John the show's most emotionally honest character. Born on April 29, 1958, in Burbank, California, directly across the street from Disney Studios, as it happened, Plum came from a household already oriented toward the arts. Her father, Neely Plum, was a recording executive and staff producer for Rekka Records, who worked on major film soundtracks. Her mother, Flora, was a professional dancer and ballerina. She had been working in television commercials since the age of 6, when a children's talent agent moved into the neighborhood and suggested she audition. What she did with her first Brady Bunch salary at the age of 11 is one of the more quietly remarkable financial decisions in the history of child acting. In 1969, the very first year the show aired, she used her earnings to purchase a beach cottage on Escondido Beach in Malibu, California, for $5,300. It was a 3-bedroom house, 805 square feet, sitting directly on the sand. She held it for 47 years. In 2016, she sold it to a developer for $9 million. A profit of nearly $85 million on a purchase made before she was old enough for secondary school. The residual checks from the Brady Bunch, she has noted, dried up long before she graduated from high school. The beach house did not. After the show ended, she worked steadily in theater and television. But she also discovered something that surprised even people who had known her for years. She was a serious painter. The process began simply, she has said, out of a need to fill the gaps between jobs. She taught herself, working through watercolors and acrylics before finding her medium in oil on canvas and linen, which gave her the blending depth and color saturation she needed. Well, she describes her style as spontaneous still life, a phrase that captures something honest about how she approached both the painting and the rest of her life. Her work has been exhibited in galleries across the United States, and she is represented by galleries in New York, Scottsdale, and Fort Lauderdale. She appeared alongside her castmates for a very Brady renovation in 2019, making peace publicly with Maureen McCormick after a long, complicated estrangement that had begun years before. By 2026, Eve Plum is 68 years old. Her memoir, Happiness Included, Jan Brady and Beyond, was published on April 28, 2006. I had a unique childhood that I would like to share now, she told People, because looking back, it gives me joy. That sentence, coming from a woman who spent years defined by a character famous for feeling overlooked, who bought a piece of California at 11 and held it for nearly half a century, carries more weight than it might first appear. He was 8 years old when the series premiered, and when Mike Lookinland walked onto that set, he had no way of knowing that the experience would leave a mark so permanent and yet so differently handled that it would take him decades to find his footing again. Born on December 19, 1960 in Mount Pleasant, Utah, Lookinland was a natural in front of the camera, open-faced, guileless, exactly what Bobby Brady needed to be. What almost no one watching at home could have known was that the boy on screen was a natural blonde. His sandy-colored, slightly wavy hair had been dyed dark brown and straightened for every episode of the first 3 seasons to make him match his TV brothers Christopher Knight and Barry Williams. The dye used was Clairol, the studio lights were hot, and on at least one occasion during filming the color ran visibly down his face. It was only in the show's final 2 seasons that the producers finally allowed his natural hair to show. Before the Brady Bunch, he had been offered 2 separate starring roles in the same year, Bobby Brady and Eddie Corbett on the courtship of Eddie's father. His family chose the Brady Bunch, specifically because it meant being around other children rather than an all-adult cast. The role of Eddie eventually went to Brandon Cruz. It is one of those almost invisible crossroads that only make sense in retrospect. After the show ended, Land quietly walked away from acting. He worked for a time as an electrical and camera technician, learning the craft from the other side of the lens. He moved to Salt Lake City. Said he built a business. Just add water custom concrete after his wife brought home a library book called How to Make Concrete Countertops, and he found himself reading it cover to cover. He has also said that he attended more than 100 Grateful Dead concerts. He came back for a very Brady renovation in 2019 and appeared with Williams and Knight as the mummies on The Masked Singer in 2020. By 2006, Mike Land is 65 years old. He is, in many ways, the Brady who most completely made a life outside the frame. She was 8 years old when the series premiered on September 26, 1969, not 5, as the character of Cindy sometimes appeared, but a working child actress who already knew how a set functioned. Susan Olsen was born on August 14, 1961, in Santa Monica, and what happened to her in the years after the show's end was, in some respects, the most turbulent story of the group. Olsen worked in television and film after the Brady Bunch, but struggled with the weight of a character that had become more famous than the person who played her. She worked in radio for years in Los Angeles, developing a voice that audiences recognized long before they recognized her face. She married 4 times, a fact she has discussed publicly and without self-pity, as evidence that life after childhood fame is rarely as straightforward as anyone outside it imagines. The radio career came to an abrupt and public end in 2016, when Olsen was fired from La Talk Radio after sending a homophobic message to an openly gay actor who had been a guest on her political talk show. The station cut ties with her immediately. It was a painful episode that would resurface years later, when CB Studios was reportedly developing a Brady Bunch revival series, a project that was shelved, according to multiple sources, partly because of Olsen's documented history of hate speech. The role she had played for over 50 years was, effectively, taken from her. She has disputed this account, but the studio's position was clear. What set Olsen apart from some of her castmates was also her willingness to speak directly about the things that were hardest in the cast's shared history. She spoke publicly about Robert Reed, about her belief that the culture's refusal to allow him to live openly had contributed to his death. She spoke about the cast's dynamics, the friendships, the estrangements, the bonds that held through decades of changed circumstances. By 2006, Susan Olsen is 64 years old. She carries Cindy Brady with her the way someone carries a childhood photograph. Present, recognizable, no longer the whole story. There's a version of this story where Maureen McCormick becomes a cautionary tale. It is not hard to tell. She was 13 years old when the Brady Bunch premiered, and the gap between Marcia Brady and the real person standing in her shoes was already enormous and growing wider. She was born on August 5, 1956, in Van Nuys, California. She had worked in television from early childhood, appearing in Barbie and chatty Kathy Doll commercials on national television at the age of 7, then in guest roles on Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, before landing Marcia. For 5 years, she inhabited one of the most recognizable characters in American popular culture, performing a version of adolescence scrubbed clean of everything that made adolescence actually difficult. What no one watching could have known was that the home she returned to after filming was nothing like the Brady house. Her older brother was battling a heroin addiction. Her father was having an affair. And then there was the shadow she carried from her own family history, the knowledge that her grandmother had died of syphilis, that her mother had contracted the disease in utero, and that she, herself, had grown up believing she might carry it too. She has described living with that unnamed fear through her entire adolescence, an anxiety running beneath the cheerful surface of Marcia Brady like water beneath ice. When the camera stopped, reality arrived without warning. In the years that followed, McCormick fell into a cocaine addiction so consuming that it reorganized her life entirely. By the early 1980s, she was arriving at auditions after days without sleep, visibly impaired, burning through opportunities with a speed she could not control. She lost an audition with Steven Spielberg for Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1980, a role that might have reshaped her trajectory entirely because she showed up unable to function. She has written about exchanging sex for drugs. about posing for a videotaped encounter at a dealer's home in exchange for cocaine, a tape that, as far as anyone knows, was never made public. About the specific humiliation of being Marcia Brady while doing things that Marcia Brady would have been horrified by. Her parents came within days of calling the police on their own daughter. The people who loved her were watching her disappear and could not find the door. What saved her, she says, was a man named Michael Cummings. She met him at church in 1985, at the exact moment when the bottom of the fall was becoming visible. He gave her an ultimatum. She chose sobriety, and she chose him. They married that same year, and in 2026 they have been together for more than 40 years. She published her memoir, Here's the Story, Surviving Marcia Brady and Finding My True Voice, in 2008, and it landed at number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. She was diagnosed with clinical depression in 1997 and has spoken about that diagnosis with the same directness she brought to the addiction years, not as something shameful, but as something real. In November 2025, she returned to the stage, performing in the off-Broadway play Pen Pals in New York. Florence Henderson died in 2016. 3 days before she went, she was sitting in that studio audience on Dancing with the Stars, watching Maureen compete, calling out that famous phrase one last time across the distance between them. McCormick has said that it was one of the most important moments of her life. By 2006, Maureen McCormick is 69 years old. She lives in Westlake Village, California, with her husband. With her husband, she is, against considerable odds, at peace, not with Marcia Brady exactly, but with the fact that Marcia Brady was only ever part of the story. 56 years, 10 people, a set of household stairs leading up to rooms that held more secrets than any script ever acknowledged. The Brady Bunch was never about reality. It was about the version of family life that Americans wanted to believe in, the version where every problem resolved within 22 minutes and nobody ever said the things that were hardest to say. But the people who made it real every week, who showed up and smiled and delivered those lines with conviction, they lived in actual time with actual consequences and actual grief. Robert Reed, who despised his most famous role and carried a secret that the era gave him no safe way to tell. Florence Henderson, who became a mother to people who were not her children and left on a Thursday afternoon before anyone had quite prepared for it. And B. Davis, who invented a whole inner life for a character and kept it private for 30 years, who walked away from fame and found something she considered far more important. And Robbie Rist, 9 years old, brought in to save a show that had already quietly decided to end, who spent the decades that followed building a career entirely on his own terms, voice acting, making music, becoming something the Cousin Oliver label could never contain. And Maureen McCormick, who fell as far as a person can fall and came back carrying something that Marcia Brady never had, the knowledge of exactly who she was. The house on the screen never existed. But the people did. That, in the end, is what lasts. Which story surprised you most? Let us know in the comments below, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. If these real stories behind television's most famous family stayed with you, subscribe. There are more of them waiting.